A long time ago, on the distant frontiers of China, a small band of travelers races across rugged terrain, desperately trying to outrun a pursuing Mongol force. Their leader, William, quickly realizes they won't survive if they keep moving as one group. Thinking fast, he orders the horses to be released, hoping the noise and movement will distract the predators trailing them. The gamble works just enough to buy them time, allowing the men to escape into the darkness. That night, as they catch their breath after the chase, the truth behind their mission comes to light. They are not soldiers of any kingdom, they're mercenaries, drawn across continents by rumors of a powerful substance known as black powder. But the journey has taken a heavy toll. More than 20 of their companions have already died along the way, and what little they have left is barely enough to survive. Exhaustion and doubt begin to creep in, and for a moment, retreat seems like the only option. Then, without warning, something emerges from the shadows. A monstrous creature lunges into their camp, moving with terrifying speed. In seconds, chaos erupts. One by one, the remaining men are slaughtered, leaving only William and his close companion, Tavar, alive. The beast circles them, preparing to strike again, but this time, William stands his ground. Timing his move perfectly, he attacks and manages to sever one of the creature's limbs, bringing it down. Neither of them understands what they've just faced, but one thing is certain: the place is no longer safe. Without wasting another moment, they abandon the camp and set out at first light. Their journey continues, but danger is never far behind. The Mongols soon catch up again, forcing William and Tavar into another desperate escape. With no clear path forward, they push themselves to the limit, until, suddenly, the landscape opens up, revealing something extraordinary. Before them stands the Great Wall, but their relief is short-lived. As they approach, a volley of arrows rains down, narrowly missing them. Realizing they have no chance of outrunning both enemies, William makes a bold decision. He surrenders to the soldiers on the wall, hoping they might show mercy. They are quickly captured and brought before the commanders. William presents the severed claw of the creature they fought, drawing immediate attention. Commander Lin demands an explanation, but when William claims he killed the beast himself, the claim is met with disbelief and ridicule. The officers laugh, dismissing his story as nonsense. Yet not everyone is convinced. Strategist Wang studies the foreigners closely, their weapons, their clothing, all stained with the same strange blood. To him, the story doesn't seem entirely impossible. Before the matter can be settled, a scout rushes in with urgent news. A massive force is approaching the wall. General Shao wastes no time. Orders are given, and the entire garrison prepares for battle. William and Tavar are taken up onto the wall, where they witness something astonishing: a vast, highly organized army, each unit distinguished by brightly colored armor, moving in perfect coordination. Among them, one group stands out. Dressed in blue, an elite force of female warriors led by Commander Lin steps forward. With discipline and precision, they take their positions at the edge of the wall, armed with long spears, ready to face whatever is coming. And then in the distance, the enemy appears. A massive wave of green, monstrous creatures surges toward the wall, their numbers overwhelming. General Shao commands the artillery to fire. Enormous siege weapons launch flaming projectiles into the sky, crashing down into the advancing horde and igniting explosions across the battlefield. Archers follow, releasing a storm of arrows that darkens the sky. Many of the creatures fall, but the rest keep coming, undeterred. Their roars grow louder as they close the distance, eventually reaching the base of the wall despite the relentless assault. At that moment, the blue-armored warriors make their move. One by one, they leap from the wall, suspended by ropes, plunging downward with their spears aimed at the creatures below. They strike with precision before being pulled back up by their comrades. It's a breathtaking display of coordination, but it comes at a cost. Many are caught midair, dragged down, and killed in brutal fashion. Then something even more alarming appears. Far beyond the chaos, the queen of the creatures arrives, surrounded by heavily armored guards. From a distance, she observes the battle, controlling her forces with eerie intelligence. Strategist Wang immediately recognizes the threat and alerts General Shao, who orders the artillery to focus on her. But every shot is intercepted. The guards shield their queen, absorbing the impact. With a deafening roar, the queen signals her army. Suddenly, the creatures change tactics. Instead of charging blindly, they begin climbing, using their own bodies to scale the wall. Within moments, they breach the defenses, swarming over the top and attacking the soldiers directly. The fight turns chaotic as warriors are thrown from the wall or torn apart by sheer force. Seeing the situation spiral out of control, William and Tavar try to break free. To their surprise, another foreigner, Ballard, cuts their restraints and sets them loose. Nearby, a young soldier named Peng watches his comrades fall. Despite his fear, he charges forward to fight, but the creature he faces easily overpowers him, knocking him aside. Just as it prepares to finish him, William intervenes. Leaping into action, he grabs a spear mid-motion and launches himself toward the beast, driving the weapon straight into its mouth. The creature recoils, roaring in pain, but it doesn't fall immediately. With Tavar's help, William presses the attack, and together they strike again, this time piercing its heart and bringing it down. Not wasting a second, Tavar picks up a fallen red cape and begins waving it, drawing the attention of another creature like a matador provoking a bull. The monster charges straight at him, blinded by aggression. That moment is all William needs. He fires an arrow with perfect timing, striking the creature and killing it just as it lunges forward. Tavar barely escapes, diving out of the way as the beast collapses behind him. For the first time since arriving, the two outsiders are no longer just prisoners, they've become part of the fight. Witnessing the heavy losses among her forces, the queen unleashes a piercing signal that ripples across the battlefield. At once, the creatures halt their assault. As if acting on a single command, they begin to withdraw, gathering the bodies of their fallen as they retreat. It's a calculated move, leaving nothing behind for the defenders to study or understand. As silence slowly returns to the wall, the Chinese commanders approach the two outsiders. William and Tavar immediately lower their weapons, making it clear they pose no threat. General Shao acknowledges what they did during the battle. Instead of treating them as prisoners, he orders that they be given proper quarters, a gesture of respect for their courage. Not long after, the young soldier Peng seeks out William. Still shaken but alive, he thanks him sincerely for stepping in when no one else could. For Peng, it wasn't just survival, it was a debt he won't forget. Soon, William and Tavar are introduced to the man who freed them earlier, Ballard. Unlike them, Ballard has been here for decades. He reveals that he too once came in search of black powder, nearly 25 years ago. But instead of leaving, he was captured and forced to remain, eventually becoming a teacher of English within the fortress. Ballard wastes no time showing them what they came for. Hidden away, he reveals a stash of the mysterious black powder, more than enough to make their dangerous journey worthwhile. To him, it's simple. Once the next battle begins, they take advantage of the chaos and escape with the powder. Ride out while everyone else is distracted, but before they can settle on a plan, they are summoned. Strategist Wang calls them in urgently, holding a strange object recovered from their belongings, a magnet. He believes this small stone might explain something unusual. According to his theory, it could have disrupted the creature William fought earlier, making it vulnerable. Then comes a revelation. The creatures have a name, Tao Tei. And their origin is even more unsettling. They are not from this world. According to records, they arrived 2,000 years ago, descending from the sky. Ever since, they have returned every 60 years, driven by a single purpose: to consume enough flesh to sustain their queen and multiply. The stakes are enormous. The capital lies only a few hundred miles away, home to millions. If the Tao Tei reach it, their numbers would surge beyond control, spreading destruction far beyond China. At the same time, General Shao receives troubling news. Soldiers stationed at the western towers have gone missing. Sensing danger, he heads out personally with Commander Lin to investigate. The troops move carefully, forming ranks as they advance. What they discover is unsettling. The bodies of the fallen haven't been eaten, left behind deliberately. Then, a creature appears ahead. As the soldiers focus on it, General Shao notices something else, a reflection behind them. Another Tao Tei, hidden, waiting to strike. The ambush is immediate. The two beasts attack in perfect coordination. General Shao engages the one behind, trying to protect Lin, but the effort costs him dearly. He is struck down, fatally wounded in the process. Reinforcements arrive moments later, but it's too late. With his final strength, General Shao names Lin as his successor. His last warning is clear: never underestimate the intelligence of these creatures. His death sends shockwaves through the army. A grand ceremony follows, honoring the fallen general. As night falls, countless lanterns are released into the sky, illuminating the darkness as a tribute to his life and leadership. Not long after, an envoy arrives from the emperor, Envoy Shen, bringing records from the previous Tao Tei invasion 60 years earlier. Among the documents is a crucial detail. During that battle, the creatures were somehow immobilized after pursuing soldiers into a mountainous region rich in magnetic stone. The connection becomes impossible to ignore. Determined to test this theory, William proposes a bold plan to capture one of the creatures alive using massive hooked weapons, much like hunting a whale. Tavar strongly objects, reminding him of their original goal. They came here for the black powder, not to get entangled in someone else's war, but the plan moves forward. Strategist Wang begins preparing powerful sedatives, coating the hooks to ensure that any captured creature can be subdued. Soon, the Tao Tei return. This time, they attempt a more subtle approach, trying to scale the wall under the cover of darkness. The defenders respond instantly. Massive rotating blades emerge from the walls, slicing through the climbing creatures, while soldiers engage them directly along the edges. At Lin's command, the harpoons are launched. Heavy chains attached to giant hooks shoot into the advancing monsters, snagging several of them. For a moment, it seems like the plan is working, but the Tao Tei adapt quickly. Realizing the danger, they begin tearing themselves free. One by one, the captured creatures break loose, except for a single one that remains trapped. Meanwhile, Ballard urges Tavar to leave now, while chaos reigns. This is their chance, but Tavar refuses. He won't abandon William. And William himself hesitates. For a brief moment, he considers walking away, taking the black powder and escaping like they planned, but something changes. At the last second, he turns back. He chooses to help. With the remaining creature still chained, the army acts fast. Explosives are launched around it, forming a ring of fire that isolates the beast from the others, but the chains won't hold forever. Without waiting, William slides down the metal structures of the wall, descending straight into the burning battlefield below. He reaches the creature, now lying motionless on the ground, subdued, but not for long. Working quickly, William secures the unconscious creature with chains so it can be hauled back up. But before he can finish, more Tao Tei burst through the haze, lunging at him from all sides. He barely holds them off, fighting desperately just to stay alive, until Tavar suddenly charges in, cutting down one of the attackers and pulling William out of danger. Frustrated, Tavar snaps at him, accusing him of throwing away their chance to escape. There's no time to argue. Shapes begin to emerge from the fog, more creatures moving fast. The two men fall into sync, fighting side by side. They've learned quickly where the monsters are vulnerable. Arrows fly, blades strike, and one by one, they take the creatures down by aiming for the eyes. But the tide turns again. The Tao Tei push through the wall of fire, ignoring the flames as they swarm the area. Within seconds, William and Tavar are surrounded. The creatures close in, ready to overwhelm them, then explosions rip through the battlefield. From above, the army unleashes a barrage of bombs, tearing through the monsters and scattering them in all directions. The blast clears the area just in time, saving both men from certain death. With the immediate threat gone, the captured creature is secured inside a reinforced cage. Strategist Wang approaches cautiously, holding the magnet. As he steps closer, something remarkable happens. The creature begins to slow, then stops moving entirely. It's as if its mind has been shut down. The theory is proven, but the moment is short-lived. Envoy Chen insists the creature must be sent to the emperor at once, despite Wang's objections. He argues they still need to study it further, but the order is absolute. It comes directly from the throne. Reluctantly, they comply. Not long after the envoy departs, new activity is detected near the base of the wall. Suspicious, the army descends to investigate. What they find is worse than anything they expected. A massive tunnel has been carved beneath the wall itself. The earlier assaults, the waves of attacks, the sacrifices were nothing more than distractions. The Tao Tei were never trying to break through the wall. They were going under it. Elsewhere, Ballard and Tavar move quickly, gathering as much black powder as they can carry. With the army distracted, this is their moment to escape. But just as they prepare to leave, William intercepts them. He refuses to go. To him, this is no longer just about survival or profit. He urges Tavar to stay and fight for something bigger than themselves. But Tavar sees it differently. He believes William is chasing a lost cause, that the people here don't stand a chance against what's coming. Their argument escalates, and then, suddenly, it ends. Ballard strikes William from behind, knocking him unconscious. He tells Tavar there's no more time. This is their only opportunity. They leave William behind. When General Lin learns of the attempted escape, her reaction is immediate, anger and disappointment. To her, it looks like betrayal. Even when William regains consciousness and insists he tried to stop them, she refuses to believe him. Only Peng steps forward. The young soldier speaks up, confirming that William did try to intervene. His words soften Lin's judgment, but not completely. She orders the traitors to be hunted down and has William locked away, removing any chance for him to interfere again. Meanwhile, the situation grows worse. With the Tao Tei already advancing underground, Lin decides to take a risky approach, using experimental hot air balloons powered by black powder to reach the capital ahead of the creatures. The plan is dangerous and untested. As the balloons launch, disaster strikes. Several fail mid-ascent, bursting into flames or collapsing, sending soldiers plummeting. Only a few manage to stay airborne, heading toward the capital. Back at the wall, Peng quietly frees William from his cell. Without hesitation, William rushes out and finds Wang, demanding answers. The truth is grim. They failed to stop the breach. The creatures are already on their way. Lin has gone ahead to the capital, and Wang believes their only remaining hope is to eliminate the queen. If she dies, the entire swarm will collapse with her. Wang urges William to leave while he still can, but William has made his choice. He's not running anymore. Instead, he sets out to find Lin. At the same time, Lin and her remaining forces arrive at the capital, only to find it already under siege. The streets are overrun. Chaos is everywhere. They push forward trying to reach the palace, but are quickly attacked by waves of Tao Tei. The fight is relentless. One by one, her soldiers fall. Lin is soon surrounded, with no clear way out. The creatures close in, their roars echoing as they prepare to strike, and then from above, William appears. He dives in, grabs Lin, and pulls her upward just as the creatures lunge. Using explosive charges, he drives the swarm back long enough for them to escape into the palace. Inside, they regroup. The captured Tao Tei has arrived as well. Wang quickly formulates a plan: strap the creature with explosives, send it through the underground tunnels, and use it as bait to reach the queen. If they can get close enough, they might end this. It's risky, but it's their only option. They move through the sewers, navigating the dark tunnels beneath the city, but the Tao Tei are already aware. The moment they're detected, the creatures swarm them, attacking from all directions. The team suffers heavy losses. In the chaos, Peng is injured but still able to fight. As more creatures pour into the tunnel, he makes a decision. He stays behind. With no hesitation, Peng detonates the explosives, collapsing the tunnel and taking the creatures with him. The path is sealed, but at the cost of his life. There's no time to stop. Pushing forward, Wang forces open a gate leading outside. The moment arrives. They release the captured creature, now armed with explosives, and send it toward the queen. The moment the magnet is pulled away, the restrained creature snaps back to life. As if guided by instinct, it immediately begins feeding on the meat placed before it. Then, just as planned, it bolts out of the area, carrying the food, rushing to deliver it to its queen. Meanwhile, William, Lin, and Wang move quickly into a nearby tower. Time is against them. Wang stays behind at the entrance, gripping the magnet, knowing it's the only thing that can slow the creatures if they break in. William and Lin push upward, climbing higher to gain a clear vantage point. From above, William spots the queen. He draws his bow, steadies himself, and fires. The arrow flies true, but before it can reach its target, the queen's guards intercept it. The projectile deflects and detonates midair, the blast lighting up the sky and instantly alerting the swarm. The element of surprise is gone. Without hesitation, William rushes even higher, determined to try again. But the queen reacts quickly. With a commanding roar, she directs her forces toward the tower. In seconds, countless Tao Tei surge forward, climbing and crashing into the structure. Below, Wang realizes what's coming. Knowing he won't make it out, he hurls the magnet upward toward William and Lin, his final act. Moments later, the creatures overwhelm him, and he is torn apart. Above, William prepares another shot. He releases the arrow, but once again, the guards block it. Another explosion bursts in the air, and this time, the queen locks onto their position. With a furious signal, she sends every nearby creature toward them. There's no more time. With only one explosive arrow remaining, William and Lin leap out of the tower windows. They swing outward on ropes, narrowly avoiding the creatures that lunge after them. In that split second, everything comes down to precision. William throws the magnet toward the queen's guards. The moment it lands, their movements falter, just enough. Lin follows instantly, launching her spear with perfect timing. The final explosive strikes its mark. The bomb lands within the queen's protected circle. For a brief moment, she struggles, trying to react, trying to stop what's coming. Then a massive explosion erupts. The blast engulfs the queen and her guards, sending a shockwave through the entire battlefield. Flames and debris scatter in every direction as the creatures are thrown violently into the air. And then, silence. With the queen destroyed, the remaining Tao Tei freeze mid-motion. One by one, they collapse, lifeless, crashing to the ground. The palace is left covered in thousands of fallen bodies. The war is over. Humanity has survived. Some time later, William returns to the Great Wall. The battlefield is quiet now, the chaos replaced with order once more. Inside the holding cells, he finds Tavar, captured after his failed escape. William reveals the truth. The Emperor gave him a choice: take the black powder and leave, or save his friend. He chose Tavar. Because in the end, no treasure, no reward is worth more than loyalty. With that, the two prepare to leave. Escorted by soldiers, William rides away from the wall. High above, General Lin watches him go. For a brief moment, their eyes meet, a silent farewell. William looks back one last time before disappearing into the distance, carrying with him the sense that this is not the end of his journey, and that one day he may return. When people hear the title The Great Wall, the first image that comes to mind is history, mystery, one of the greatest architectural achievements ever built by human hands. You expect a war epic. You expect politics, empire, invasion, legacy. What you probably do not expect is a monster movie. And that is the first thing this film does. It takes one of the most iconic structures in human civilization and builds its entire premise around a fantastical question. What if the Great Wall wasn't only built to keep invading armies out, but to keep something far worse from getting in? That idea alone is the foundation of the movie's identity. The story begins not with emperors or generals, but with outsiders. Two European mercenaries, William and Tavar, arrive in China chasing something valuable, black powder. Their goal is not noble. They are not here to protect anyone. They are not here to admire a civilization. They are here for profit, for advantage, for survival. They are thieves before they are heroes, opportunists before they become witnesses to something much larger than themselves. And that choice matters, because the film's setup is built on collision. Not just a collision between men and monsters, but between greed and duty, between outsiders and an ancient order, between people chasing personal gain and people who have dedicated their entire lives to collective defense. That's what gives the premise its shape. What starts as a search for gunpowder quickly transforms into something else entirely. These mercenaries stumble into a military world already in motion, a disciplined force stationed at the wall, preparing not for political conflict, but for a recurring, almost mythic threat. The enemy is not another kingdom. It is not a rival army. It is a monstrous horde that returns in cycles, attacking with force, scale, and near-mechanical certainty. So right away, the film reframes itself. This is not a story about discovering China. It is a story about being trapped inside a war that was already waiting to happen. That's one of the more effective parts of the setup. The central characters do not arrive as chosen ones. They arrive as intruders. They don't understand the rules, the history, or the scale of what they are stepping into. And for a while, that unfamiliarity works in the film's favor. It creates curiosity. Why is this army so organized? Why is the wall prepared like a fortress against something more terrifying than human invasion? What exactly is out there in the dark? The movie uses that uncertainty well, at least in the beginning, and then comes the reveal. The wall is part of an enormous defense system against the Tao Tei, a monstrous species that attacks in devastating waves. From that point on, the premise becomes very clear. Survival depends on discipline. The wall is humanity's line of defense, and William, who came here to steal, is forced into a situation where escape, loyalty, and self-interest begin to collide. That's the core setup in its simplest form. A foreign mercenary enters China in search of wealth and finds himself inside a war for civilization itself. It's a strong blockbuster premise because it's easy to understand, visually immediate, and built for escalation. It gives the film a clean engine. You have strangers in unfamiliar territory. You have a spectacular location with mythic weight. You have an army with ritual, structure, and purpose. And you have a creature threat large enough to justify the scale the movie is aiming for. There's also something smart in how the setup ties character motive into the larger conflict. William begins as someone motivated by reward. The soldiers of the wall are motivated by duty. That contrast gives the opening act its dramatic tension. Even before the story gets deeper into battle mechanics and monster attacks, it already has a clear moral frame. One side fights for survival and sacrifice, the other begins from self-interest. Now, whether the film develops that as deeply as it could is another question. But as a premise, it works, because it's clean, it's cinematic, and it immediately tells you what kind of experience you're about to get. This is not grounded realism. This is not historical reconstruction. This is myth, fantasy, siege warfare, and creature spectacle wrapped around one of the most recognizable landmarks in the world. And honestly, that's part of what makes the setup memorable. The idea of using the Great Wall not simply as background, but as the literal frontline in a war against overwhelming creatures, gives the movie an instant hook. Even people who end up disliking the film often remember the premise, because it's such an aggressively high-concept pitch. It sounds like something built to be sold in one sentence, and sometimes those are the ideas that land fastest with audiences. A pair of mercenaries, a quest for black powder, a legendary wall, a secret war, a monstrous enemy, and a man forced to become part of a cause he never came there to serve. That is the engine of the Great Wall. And as far as pure setup goes, it's easy to see why the film had appeal. It takes a globally recognized symbol, fuses it with mythology and blockbuster fantasy, and gives the audience a premise that is immediate, visual, and built for spectacle from the very first act. Whether the film ultimately rises to the level of that promise is debatable, but the setup itself, it absolutely knows how to pull you in. One of the most important things to understand about the Great Wall is what it is not. It is not a historical epic. It is not a grounded war drama. and it is definitely not trying to recreate the real story behind one of the world's greatest landmarks. Because the moment you expect that, the film starts to fall apart. Instead, this movie makes a very deliberate choice, one that defines everything about how it should be watched. It chooses fantasy over history, spectacle over realism, entertainment over depth. At its core, this is a creature feature wrapped in blockbuster armor. And once you accept that, the entire experience changes. Because suddenly, all the things that might feel wrong in a serious historical film, the exaggerated action, the over-the-top visuals, the stylized combat, the endless waves of monsters, start to make sense within the world the film is actually operating in. This isn't about accuracy. This is about scale, color, movement, and impact. The tone reflects that from the very beginning. There's a kind of heightened reality to everything. The armies move with precision that feels almost theatrical. The battles are choreographed not just for survival, but for spectacle. Even the way the film uses color, the bright armor, the coordinated formations, it all leans into something closer to visual performance than grounded warfare. At times, it almost feels like watching a live-action painting in motion. But here's where things get interesting. Because while the film clearly embraces fantasy, it doesn't always fully commit to the tone that comes with it. There's a noticeable tension running throughout the movie. On one side, you have a concept that is inherently absurd, monstrous creatures attacking the Great Wall in massive, synchronized waves. On the other, you have a film that often plays this idea completely straight, and that creates a tonal imbalance, because moments that could feel thrilling sometimes come across as unintentionally funny. Scenes that should lean into their own ridiculousness instead treat themselves with a level of seriousness that doesn't always fit the material. And as a result, the film occasionally feels caught between two identities. Is it a bold, self-aware monster spectacle, or is it trying to be something more grounded and epic? It never fully decides, and that indecision shapes how the audience experiences it. For some viewers, this works. The film becomes exactly what it promises, a fast, colorful, action-heavy ride that doesn't ask too many questions and doesn't pretend to be deeper than it is. It's the kind of movie you watch for the visuals, for the battles, for the sheer scale of what's happening on screen. In that sense, it's pure popcorn cinema, easy to follow, easy to enjoy, easy to forget. For others, though, that same tone becomes the film's biggest limitation, because when a movie presents itself with this level of scale, this level of ambition, you start expecting something more. More weight, more emotional grounding, more identity, and when that doesn't come, what's left can feel hollow. That's why so many people describe this film in the same way. It's like cinematic fast food. It's satisfying in the moment. It's built to grab your attention quickly. It delivers flavor, energy, and impact, but it doesn't necessarily stay with you once it's over. And that's not inherently a bad thing, because not every film needs to be profound. Not every story needs to carry heavy themes or emotional complexity. Sometimes, the goal is simply to entertain, to create something visually engaging, fast-paced, and accessible to a wide audience. And The Great Wall absolutely understands that goal. The issue is that it occasionally hints at being something more, without fully becoming it. There are moments where the film leans toward deeper ideas, about duty, sacrifice, unity, but they pass quickly. The tone never slows down long enough to explore them in a meaningful way. Instead, it keeps moving, pushing forward, prioritizing action over reflection. And that's ultimately what defines the film's identity. It's not confused in what it wants to show you, but it is conflicted in how seriously it wants you to take it. So the best way to approach it, the way many viewers found the most enjoyment, is simple. Don't treat it like a historical film. Don't expect realism. Don't expect depth. Treat it like what it is, a large-scale fantasy spectacle, a stylized monster movie, a visually driven action experience designed for the big screen. Because once you meet it on those terms, the film becomes a lot easier to enjoy and a lot easier to understand. There's a moment early in the film, subtle but important, where everything clicks into place. Because once you understand how the Great Wall treats history, you understand the entire movie. This is not history as it happened. This is not even history as it might have happened. This is history reimagined through myth, and that distinction matters, because the film takes something real, something iconic, something deeply rooted in human achievement, and asks a question that completely shifts its meaning. What if the Great Wall wasn't built just to defend against human enemies, but against something ancient, monstrous, and far beyond human understanding? That idea transforms the wall from a symbol of defense into a symbol of survival. And from that point forward, the film stops being historical and becomes something closer to alternate history infused with legend. The monsters themselves are not random creations. They're tied, loosely, to mythology. They're presented as creatures that have existed for centuries, attacking in cycles, almost like a natural disaster. something inevitable, something humanity has learned to endure rather than eliminate. That framing is important because it gives the conflict a sense of rhythm. This isn't a war that just began. It's a war that has been happening over and over again, and the wall isn't just a structure, it's part of a system. A defense mechanism built over generations, refined, disciplined, prepared for something the outside world doesn't even know exists. That's where the film finds one of its more interesting ideas. The world inside the wall knows the truth. The world outside doesn't, so when outsiders arrive, when mercenaries wander into this space, they aren't just entering a new country, they're stepping into a reality that has been hidden from them, a reality where myth isn't a story, it's a threat. And that contrast between what is known and what is believed creates a kind of narrative tension, even if the film doesn't fully explore it. Because instead of diving deep into the mythology, the film uses it as a foundation. It gives you just enough to understand the stakes, just enough to accept the world, and then it moves forward. That's where the alternate history aspect becomes clear. This isn't about reconstructing the past. It's about reshaping it into something cinematic. The timeline becomes flexible. The purpose of the wall becomes symbolic rather than literal. Historical accuracy gives way to visual storytelling. And the film doesn't try to hide that, it embraces it. Even the way the military is presented reflects this approach. You're not watching a historically precise army. You're watching a stylized, almost ritualistic force, divided into units, defined by color, operating with precision that feels as much theatrical as it does tactical. It's history filtered through imagination, and that's where the film draws a clear line. It doesn't want to teach you about the past. It wants to reinterpret it. For some viewers, that's part of the appeal. There's something undeniably compelling about taking a real-world wonder and layering it with legend. It turns something familiar into something mysterious again. It adds scale, not just physically, but conceptually. The Great Wall becomes more than a monument. It becomes a battlefield, a barrier between worlds, a line between civilization and chaos. But for others, this approach creates distance. Because when a film uses something so historically significant and reshapes it so dramatically, it risks losing the weight that comes with it. The wall stops feeling like a real place with real history and starts feeling like a backdrop for spectacle. And that's the trade-off. By choosing myth over realism, the film gains freedom but loses grounding. It gains imagination but sacrifices authenticity, and whether that works for you depends entirely on what you expect going in. If you're looking for a historical narrative, this approach won't satisfy you. But if you're willing to accept the film on its own terms, as a fusion of legend, fantasy, and alternate history, then the premise becomes something else entirely. Not a retelling, but a reinterpretation. A story that takes a piece of the real world and asks, what if everything we thought we knew about it was only part of the truth? If there's one area where the Great Wall becomes impossible to ignore, it's the way the story is built. Because beneath all the scale, all the color, all the spectacle, what you're left with is a narrative that feels surprisingly familiar. Almost too familiar. From the moment the film begins, you can sense the structure guiding everything forward. It doesn't unfold organically. It doesn't surprise you. Instead, it moves with a kind of mechanical certainty, as if every major beat has already been decided long before the story even starts. And in many ways, it has. This is a film that follows a very clear, very recognizable formula. Outsiders arrive in a foreign land. They encounter a hidden threat. They earn the trust of a disciplined force. They prove their worth in battle. They transition from self-interest to heroism, and eventually, they become part of something bigger than themselves. You've seen this arc before, and the film doesn't try to hide it. It leans into it. Now, that's not automatically a problem. Familiar structures can work, sometimes extremely well, when they're executed with depth, emotion, or a unique perspective. But here, the issue isn't just familiarity. It's how little the film does to evolve beyond it. The plot moves quickly, but not necessarily intelligently. Events happen because they need to happen, not because they feel earned. Revelations arrive exactly when the story requires them, often without build-up. Solutions appear just in time, sometimes with a level of convenience that feels less like strategy and more like necessity. There's a sense that the story is always trying to catch up with its own momentum. And because of that, the logic starts to loosen. Characters make decisions quickly, sometimes too quickly. Relationships shift without much development. Key moments that should carry emotional weight pass by before they have time to land. Even major turning points feel more like checkpoints than consequences. It's not that the story doesn't make sense, it's that it rarely feels earned, and that's a crucial difference. Because when a narrative is built around spectacle, it needs structure to ground it. It needs cause and effect to create tension. It needs progression to give meaning to the action. Here, that progression often feels compressed. The film introduces ideas, then resolves them almost immediately. It sets up conflicts, then moves past them before they can deepen. It builds toward moments, then rushes through them without allowing them to resonate. It's a story that's constantly moving forward, but not always building upward. And that's where predictability becomes most noticeable. You don't just recognize the structure, you start anticipating it. You know when a character is going to change. You know when a sacrifice is coming. You know when the final confrontation is being set up. The film doesn't subvert expectations, it follows them, step by step. Even the central transformation, the shift from mercenary to hero, plays out exactly as you'd expect. There's no real deviation, no moment that truly challenges the trajectory. It's clean, it's simple, and it's entirely predictable. Again, that doesn't mean it fails, because for some viewers, this kind of structure is exactly what makes the film accessible. It's easy to follow, easy to process. You're never confused about what's happening or where the story is going, but accessibility comes at a cost, because without complexity, there's very little tension. Without uncertainty, there's very little suspense. And without emotional buildup, there's very little impact. The film gives you the outline of a compelling story, but rarely fills it in with enough detail to make it feel complete. And yet, there's something interesting about how intentional this seems. It almost feels like the story was designed around the action, rather than the other way around. As if the filmmakers started with the set pieces, the battles, the visuals, the spectacle, and then constructed a narrative just strong enough to connect them. Which would explain why everything feels so direct, so streamlined, so efficient. It's a story that doesn't want to slow down, it doesn't want to pause for reflection, it doesn't want to complicate itself. It wants to move from one moment of impact to the next, and if you accept that, the structure starts to make more sense. Because this isn't a film trying to challenge storytelling conventions, it's a film using them as a foundation. Familiar beats, recognizable arcs, clear progression, all designed to support the real focus of the experience, the spectacle. So when you look at the Great Wall purely as a narrative, it may feel thin, predictable, even rushed. But when you look at it as a vehicle, a framework built to deliver scale, action, and visual intensity, then the simplicity starts to feel intentional, not ambitious, but functional. If there's one thing the Great Wall almost never struggles with, it's movement. This is a film that does not like to sit still. From the opening moments, it pushes forward with urgency. There's no long setup, no slow burn introduction, no extended world-building phase. Instead, it drops you straight into motion, chase, attack, survival, and from that point on, it rarely lets go. And for a lot of viewers, that's exactly what makes it work. Because whatever you think about the story, the characters, or the logic, the film keeps you engaged through sheer momentum. It moves quickly, it moves constantly. And more importantly, it keeps giving you something to look at. There's always another beat, another shift, another escalation. One moment, the characters are running for survival. The next, they're inside the wall. Then suddenly training, strategy, formations, tension, and before you can fully process it, the first major battle hits. There's barely any downtime, and that pacing becomes the film's strongest weapon. Because even when the narrative feels thin, the film doesn't give you much time to dwell on it. It doesn't pause long enough for the cracks to fully show. It keeps pushing forward, almost as if it knows that slowing down would expose its weaknesses. So instead, it leans into speed, and when that works, it works well. The action feels immediate, the transitions feel sharp, the experience feels continuous. You're carried from one sequence to another without resistance, without interruption. It's a kind of cinematic momentum that prioritizes engagement over reflection. But here's where things get more complicated, because while the film moves fast, it doesn't always move effectively. There's a difference between pacing and progression. Pacing is about speed, progression is about buildup, and this film often chooses one over the other. Moments that should feel important, moments that should carry emotional weight or narrative significance, arrive and disappear quickly. There's little time to absorb what's happening, to connect with it, or to feel the consequences. The film doesn't linger, it doesn't breathe, it doesn't give you space, and because of that, certain sequences, no matter how visually impressive, can start to feel interchangeable. The first battle feels intense, detailed, exciting, but as the film continues, the rhythm begins to repeat. Attack, defend, regroup, escalate. The pattern becomes clear, and once you recognize the pattern, the momentum starts to shift. Not in speed, but in impact, because without variation, even fast pacing can begin to feel repetitive, and that's where the film runs into its biggest challenge. It keeps moving, but it doesn't always build. The energy stays high, but the stakes don't always rise with it. The action continues, but the emotional investment doesn't necessarily deepen. You're watching events unfold, but you're not always feeling them evolve. Still, there's something undeniably effective about the way the film handles its rhythm overall. It knows its audience. It understands that many viewers aren't here for complex storytelling or layered character arcs. They're here for spectacle, for action, for momentum, and the film delivers that. It's structured almost like a ride, one that keeps accelerating, rarely slows down, and is designed to keep your attention from start to finish. Even if certain moments blur together, the experience itself remains active. And that's important, because in a film built around scale and visual impact, losing momentum would be fatal. Here, it never does. Even at its weakest, it keeps moving. Even when the story falters, the pace carries it forward. So in the end, pacing becomes both the film's strength and its limitation. It keeps you watching. But it doesn't always give you something to hold on to. It drives the experience forward, but rarely lets it settle. And that defines the rhythm of The Great Wall more than anything else. A film powered not by depth, but by motion. If there's one place where The Great Wall fully commits, without hesitation, without restraint, it's here. The action, the battles, the spectacle, this is the film's core language. Not dialogue, not character, not even story, movement, impact, scale. From the very first major confrontation, the movie makes its priorities clear. You're not here to watch subtlety unfold. You're here to witness something large, something loud, something designed to overwhelm the screen. And in that sense, the film absolutely delivers. The battles are built around a simple but effective idea: defense against impossible odds, an army positioned along a towering wall, a horizon filled with movement. And then suddenly, an incoming force that doesn't just attack, it surges, wave after wave. The creatures don't arrive like individuals. They arrive like a flood, climbing, colliding, overwhelming the structure itself. It's less like fighting an enemy, and more like trying to hold back a living tide. And visually, that concept works. There's a sense of scale in these moments that's hard to ignore. Thousands of bodies moving at once. Coordinated formations responding in real time. Explosions, projectiles, aerial assaults, all layered together into sequences that are constantly in motion. But what makes these battles stand out isn't just their size. It's their style. This isn't grounded warfare. It's choreographed, almost ritualistic at times. Soldiers move in synchronized patterns. Units are defined by color, by role, by purpose. Each group operates like part of a larger machine, precise, disciplined, unified. And then there are the more stylized elements. Warriors diving from the wall, tethered by ropes. Aerial attacks that feel closer to performance than combat. Weapons and strategies that prioritize visual impact as much as functionality. It's not realism. It's designed spectacle. And when it works, it creates moments that feel unique, moments that separate the film from more traditional battle sequences. There's a theatrical quality to it, a sense that every movement is meant to be seen, to be remembered, to be part of something visually striking. But that same stylization also creates distance. Because the more choreographed the action becomes, the less grounded it feels, and that affects how the battles evolve. The first major encounter often carries the most impact. It's new, it's detailed. It introduces the mechanics of the conflict, the scale, the strategy, the visual language. There's tension because you're still discovering how this world works. But as the film continues, that impact begins to shift. The structure of the battles becomes more predictable. The rhythm starts to repeat. Attack, defense, escalation, reset. And while the visuals remain impressive, the sense of progression begins to fade. Each new sequence adds scale, but not always variation. And without that variation, even large-scale action can start to feel familiar. There are moments, especially in later battles, where the film leans more into quantity than creativity. More creatures, more explosions, more movement, but not necessarily more depth in how those elements are used. It becomes about amplifying what's already there, rather than evolving it. Still, it's hard to deny the film's commitment to spectacle. It doesn't hold back. It doesn't scale down. It pushes every sequence to feel big, immediate, and visually engaging. And for many viewers, that's enough. Because even when the logic feels questionable, even when the strategy feels thin, even when the repetition starts to show, the film continues to deliver moments that are simply fun to watch. That's the key. These battles aren't built to be studied. They're built to be experienced. They're designed for the big screen, for movement, color, and impact, for the kind of visual intensity that keeps your attention locked, even when the story behind it isn't doing the same. And that's where The Great Wall finds its identity, not in realism, not in complexity, but in its willingness to turn every major confrontation into a spectacle, a collision of scale, color, and motion. A series of battles that may not always evolve, but rarely stop moving. At first glance, the battles in The Great Wall don't just look big, they look organized. There's structure, there's coordination, there's a system behind the chaos. And that's what makes the opening confrontation so effective. because it doesn't feel random, it feels planned. From the moment the first attack begins, you can see how this army operates. Units move with precision, signals are clear. Roles are defined, every group has a purpose, and every movement feels like part of a larger strategy. You're not just watching a fight, you're watching a defense system in action. There's something compelling about that. The idea that this war isn't new, that it's been studied, prepared for, refined over time, gives the battle a sense of intelligence. The soldiers aren't reacting blindly. They know what's coming, they've trained for it. And for a moment, it feels like the film is building toward something deeper, a war of tactics, a clash of evolving strategies, a battle of adaptation between two forces learning from each encounter. But then something shifts. Because while the structure is there, the strategy doesn't always follow through. As the film progresses, the battles begin to lean less on logic and more on visual repetition. The same patterns return, the same formations, the same rhythms of attack and response. And while that consistency initially feels like discipline, it gradually starts to feel like limitation, because the enemy adapts, the scale increases, the stakes rise. But the response doesn't always evolve with it. That's where the sense of repetition begins to set in. The first battle introduces the system, the second reinforces it. By the third, you start to recognize it. And by the fourth, you're waiting for it to change, but it rarely does. And that's where the film misses an opportunity. Because in a story built around recurring attacks, around a war that happens in cycles, you expect escalation. You expect innovation. You expect both sides to learn, to adjust, to push each other into new territory. Instead, the film often chooses to repeat the spectacle rather than develop it. More creatures, more explosions, more intensity, but not necessarily more strategy. There are moments, small glimpses, where the film hints at something more. A new idea, a different approach, a shift in how the battle could be fought. But those moments pass quickly, never fully explored, never expanded into something that reshapes the conflict. And as a result, the battles begin to blur together. Not visually, they remain large, colorful, energetic, but structurally, they start to feel like variations of the same encounter rather than distinct stages of a larger war. Even some of the more stylized elements, the aerial assaults, the synchronized dives, the elaborate formations, while visually striking, raise questions about practicality. They look impressive, but they don't always feel grounded in strategy. At times, it feels less like a battle being fought and more like a performance being repeated, and that affects tension. Because when you understand the pattern, the unpredictability fades. When you know how the system works, the sense of danger becomes more controlled. And when the strategy doesn't evolve, the conflict stops feeling like a challenge and starts feeling like a routine. But here's the thing, even with all of that, the battles are still engaging, because the film compensates. It uses scale, it uses movement, it uses visual energy to keep the experience alive, even when the structure beneath it isn't changing. So while the strategy may feel limited, the spectacle keeps moving forward, and that's the trade-off. The film builds a foundation that suggests depth, a world where warfare is calculated, disciplined, evolving. But instead of fully developing that idea, it chooses to maintain a consistent rhythm, a cycle, one that mirrors the very threat the characters are fighting, repetition without transformation. And in a strange way, that becomes part of the film's identity, a battle system that looks complex, but rarely grows beyond its initial design. If there's one area where the Great Wall doesn't hesitate, where it doesn't hold back, doesn't second-guess itself, it's the way it looks. Because visually, this film wants to be remembered. From the very first wide shot, you can feel it. The scale, the symmetry, the intention behind every frame. This isn't a film trying to disappear into realism. It's a film trying to announce itself. And it does that through color, not subtle color, not naturalistic tones, bold, deliberate, almost theatrical color. Entire armies are defined by it. Units don't just serve different roles, they look different. Blues, reds, yellows, each group moving in formation like part of a living mosaic. It turns the battlefield into something more than chaos. It turns it into design, and that's where the cinematography becomes interesting. Because instead of trying to hide the scale, the film leans into it. Wide shots dominate. The wall stretches across the frame, not just as a structure, but as a symbol, long, rigid, imposing. The camera often pulls back to remind you of where you are, of how small the characters are compared to the world around them. It's not just about showing action, it's about showing space, height, distance, depth. And within that space, the film creates contrast. Bright armor against muted stone, green creatures against gray architecture, fire cutting through fog and dust. Every major visual element is designed to stand out, to separate itself from the background, to make each moment immediately readable, even at a distance. That's not accidental. That's visual clarity at scale. And in large battle sequences, that matters. because when you're dealing with hundreds, sometimes thousands of moving elements, the only way to keep it coherent is through strong visual identity. The film understands that, but it also pushes beyond clarity into something more stylized. There are moments where the visuals feel almost painterly, formations move in symmetry, action unfolds in layers. The composition of certain shots feels less like something captured and more like something arranged. It's not just realism, it's presentation, and that ties directly into the director's approach. There's a clear preference here for spectacle through design, for creating images that are memorable not because they're realistic, but because they're striking, because they stay in your mind, and for many viewers that works. Because even when the story fades, the images don't. You remember the colors, you remember the scale, you remember the way the battlefield looked, but at the same time, there's a limitation to this approach. Because while the film looks big, it doesn't always feel big. There are moments, despite the wide shots, despite the scale, where the world feels strangely contained, like you're only seeing pieces of something larger, rather than the full scope of it. The wall is massive, but the story often stays within a narrow slice of it, and that creates a subtle disconnect, visually expansive, but narratively confined. Then there's the question of realism. Because for all its visual strength, the film doesn't always try to convince you that what you're seeing is real. Some environments feel grounded, others feel constructed. The line between physical and digital isn't always hidden, it's sometimes part of the look. And again, that comes back to intention. This isn't a film trying to replicate reality, it's a film trying to design an experience, something heightened, something stylized, something that prioritizes how it looks over how believable it is. And depending on what you're looking for, that can either be a strength or a distraction. But one thing is clear. Whether you're impressed by it or pulled out of it, The Great Wall commits to its visual identity. It chooses color over subtlety, scale over intimacy, design over realism. And in doing so, it creates a film that may not always stay with you emotionally, but almost always leaves you with something to look at. On paper, The Great Wall has everything it needs to feel epic. A legendary structure stretching across miles, an army trained for a war that defines their existence, a threat so massive it arrives in waves, and a battlefield that should feel larger than life. All the ingredients are there. And visually, the film tries to deliver on that promise. You see wide landscapes, towering walls, endless formations, massive clashes between humans and creatures. It looks big, it sounds big, it moves like something big. But here's the strange part. Despite all of that, it doesn't always feel epic. And that's a very different thing, because scale is what you see, epicness is what you feel. Scale is measured in numbers, how many soldiers, how wide the battlefield, how large the environment. Epicness is measured in impact, how much weight those elements carry, how much presence they create, how deeply they pull you into the moment. And this is where the film begins to divide. Because while it constantly shows you scale, it doesn't always build the sense of magnitude that comes with it. The Great Wall itself should feel overwhelming, a structure shaped by time, history, and human effort. But in the film, you often experience it in segments, isolated sections, controlled environments, specific viewpoints. You rarely feel the full stretch of it. You rarely feel the journey across it. You rarely feel its true enormity. It becomes less of a world and more of a setting. The same applies to the battles. There are thousands of creatures, massive waves of movement, constant action. But the film focuses so tightly on immediate sequences that the larger war, the broader conflict, sometimes fades into the background. You see the fight in front of you, but you don't always feel the war around it, and that's the difference. An epic doesn't just show you scale, it immerses you in it. It gives you a sense of progression, of distance, of consequence. It allows moments to breathe, to expand, to settle. It creates space for the audience to absorb what they're seeing. Here, the film rarely pauses long enough for that to happen. It moves quickly, it cuts rapidly. It shifts from one sequence to another without fully letting the weight of each moment sink in. And because of that, the scale becomes something you register, rather than something you experience. There's also the question of perspective. In truly epic storytelling, the world feels bigger than the characters. The characters are part of something vast, something they can't fully control. But here, the focus often stays close. The narrative follows a narrow path, centered on a few individuals, within a much larger environment that remains mostly unexplored. So instead of expanding outward, the story stays contained. And that containment limits the sense of epicness. Even the emotional scale plays a role. Epic films don't just rely on visual size, they build emotional weight. They give you reasons to care about the outcome, to feel the stakes, to understand what's being lost or protected. Without that connection, scale can start to feel hollow, impressive but distant. And that's the balance The Great Wall struggles with. It has the visuals, it has the setting, it has the potential for something truly massive. But it doesn't always translate that into a feeling, because epicness isn't just about how big something looks, it's about how deeply it resonates. It's about whether the world feels alive beyond what you see on screen, whether the conflict feels larger than the moment you're watching, whether the story expands beyond its immediate focus. And here, that expansion feels limited. So what you're left with is a film that looks epic but doesn't always become epic. A story built on one of the greatest wonders in the world that sometimes feels smaller than it should. There's no getting around it. The Great Wall is a film built on digital foundations. From the creatures to the environments to entire sequences of battle, CGI isn't just part of the experience, it is the experience, and that immediately creates a divide. Because when a film leans this heavily into digital imagery, everything comes down to one question: do you believe what you're seeing? For some viewers, the answer is yes. The scale is impressive. The creatures move in massive, coordinated waves. The environments stretch beyond what practical filmmaking could achieve. There's a sense of spectacle, of something larger than reality, that only digital tools can create. In those moments, the CGI works exactly as intended. It enhances the world, it amplifies the action, it makes the impossible visible. But for others, that same digital presence becomes impossible to ignore, because instead of disappearing into the story, the effects start to stand out. You notice the smoothness, the perfection, the way light hits surfaces just a little too cleanly, the way movement sometimes lacks weight, and suddenly, instead of watching a battle, you feel like you're watching something constructed. That's the challenge with heavy CGI. The more you rely on it, the harder it becomes to hide it, and the Great Wall doesn't always try to. There are moments where the digital nature of the film feels almost intentional, like it's embracing a stylized, slightly artificial look. The creatures, for example, aren't designed to feel completely realistic. They're exaggerated, almost symbolic in their movement and behavior, but that stylization comes with a cost. Because without a strong sense of physical grounding, the stakes can start to feel less tangible. When everything looks digital, everything can start to feel weightless. Explosions don't always carry impact. Creatures don't always feel like they occupy real space. Even large-scale destruction can feel more like visual noise than physical consequence, and that's where immersion begins to break. There's also the issue of consistency. Some sequences look polished, detailed, carefully rendered. Others feel rushed, less refined, more obviously constructed. The quality doesn't always hold steady across the entire film, and that inconsistency makes the artificiality more noticeable, especially in scenes where digital elements interact directly with human characters. That's where the illusion is tested the most, because if the interaction doesn't feel seamless, if the environment doesn't feel solid, the entire scene starts to lose its impact. And yet, despite all of this, the film still manages to create moments that work, because even when the CGI feels artificial, it still delivers scale. You still see the waves of creatures. You still feel the volume of movement. You still recognize the ambition behind what the film is trying to show. It's just that the experience shifts. Instead of being immersed in a believable world, you're observing a constructed one, and for some viewers, that's enough. Because the film isn't necessarily aiming for realism. It's aiming for visual intensity, for spectacle, for movement, for something that fills the screen and keeps your attention. And in that sense, the CGI does its job. But it also defines the film's limits, because when the digital layer becomes too visible, it creates distance between the audience and the story. It reminds you that what you're watching isn't happening, it's being generated. And once that awareness sets in, it's hard to ignore. So in the end, the CGI in The Great Wall becomes both a strength and a weakness. It gives the film its scale, it gives it its spectacle, it makes the impossible possible. But at the same time, it makes the world feel less real, less grounded, less tangible, and that balance between impressive and artificial is where the film lives, right in the middle. Every monster movie lives or dies by one thing. The creatures, not just how they look, but how they feel, how they move, how they threaten the world around them. And in The Great Wall, the creatures, the Tao Tei, aren't just enemies. They're the entire reason the story exists. From a conceptual level, there's something interesting here. These aren't random beasts. They're tied, at least loosely, to mythology. They arrive in cycles. They behave as a collective. They aren't just attacking, they're following a pattern, a system. Almost like a force of nature that humanity has learned to anticipate, but never fully control. That idea gives them weight. This isn't a one-time invasion. It's a recurring nightmare, and that alone should make them terrifying. But then the film builds on that. Instead of treating the creatures as individual threats, it presents them as part of something larger, a hive, a network, a coordinated force driven by a central intelligence. That changes the dynamic immediately. because now it's not just about killing monsters, it's about understanding them, how they move, how they communicate, how they respond. There's even a suggestion that they adapt, that they're not just mindless attackers, but something more organized, more deliberate. And when that idea comes through, it adds a layer of tension the film doesn't always get from its characters. Because a coordinated enemy is always more dangerous than a chaotic one, and visually, the film leans into that coordination. The creatures don't trickle in, they surge. They climb over each other, forming living structures, overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers and collective motion. It creates an image that's hard to ignore, less like a battle and more like a flood, but here's where the division begins. Because while the concept has potential, the execution doesn't always match it. The design of the creatures themselves is familiar. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Many great creature designs build on recognizable elements. But here, that familiarity becomes harder to overlook. The shapes, the movement, even the way they attack, it all feels like something you've seen before. And because of that, the creatures struggle to stand out. They're present, they're constant. They're numerous, but they're not always memorable, and that affects their impact. Because a truly effective monster doesn't just threaten the characters, it stays with the audience. It creates a sense of identity, something distinct enough that you can recognize it instantly. Here, the Tao Tei function more as a collective presence than as individual icons, and while that works for scale, it weakens their personality. There's also the question of realism. Not realism in the sense of biology, but in the sense of presence. Do they feel like they exist in the world? Sometimes, yes. Their movement, their speed, their aggression, it can feel overwhelming, especially in large numbers. But at other times, the digital nature of their design becomes more noticeable. They look smooth, controlled, almost too perfect. And when that happens, the threat begins to shift, from something immersive to something observed. You're no longer reacting to the creatures. You're watching them, and that distance matters, because fear, whether it's tension, urgency, or dread, relies on connection, on the feeling that what you're seeing has weight, has consequence, has presence. Without that, the creatures become part of the spectacle, not the danger. Still, there are moments where the film gets it right. Moments where the scale, the coordination, the sheer volume of movement creates something genuinely intense. Moments where the idea of a hive-driven force, endless, relentless, synchronized, starts to feel overwhelming. And in those moments, the threat works, not because of individual design, but because of collective force. So in the end, the Tao Tei exist in an interesting space. Conceptually, they have potential. Visually, they have scale. Structurally, they create pressure. But in execution, they don't always evolve beyond their role. They're not iconic. They're not deeply explored. They're not always as frightening as they could be. They are, above all else, a mechanism, a force designed to keep the story moving, to justify the battles, to fill the screen. And while that's enough to drive the spectacle, it's not always enough to make them unforgettable. If there's one area where the Great Wall feels the most deliberate, the most crafted, the most designed, it's the world itself. Because beyond the monsters, beyond the battles, what really gives this film its identity is how it builds its military universe. This isn't just an army, it's a system, a structure, a culture, a visual language that defines how everything operates. And that starts with the armor. Each division of the army isn't just identified by role, but by color, bold, distinct, unmistakable. Blues, reds, yellows, each one signaling a specific function within the larger defense. It's not subtle, it's not meant to be, it's meant to be seen. And that choice does two things at once. First, it creates immediate clarity. In the middle of large-scale battles, where hundreds of soldiers are moving at once, you can instantly recognize who is doing what, who's attacking, who's defending, who's leading. But second, it turns the battlefield into something more than war. It turns it into visual organization, almost like watching a living diagram, each unit moving in sync, each color forming patterns across the wall. It's not just practical, it's aesthetic. And that aesthetic extends beyond the armor. Look at the weapons, the tools, the systems built into the wall itself. This isn't a random collection of defenses. It's a carefully constructed environment designed for a very specific purpose. Every element feels intentional. The positioning of soldiers, the structure of the towers, the mechanisms used during battle. It all suggests a world that has been preparing for this threat, not for days or months, but for generations. That's where the world building becomes effective. Because even if the film doesn't dive deeply into the history, you can feel it in the design. You can see the discipline, the repetition, the refinement. This is a military force that has trained for one thing and one thing only, and the set design reinforces that idea. The wall itself isn't just a backdrop, it's integrated into the action. Platforms, towers, pathways, everything is used. The environment becomes part of the strategy, part of the movement, part of the choreography. It's not just where the battle happens, it's how the battle happens. And visually, that gives the film a strong foundation, because no matter how chaotic the action becomes, the world around it remains structured. But here's where things get interesting. Because while the design is detailed, while the visuals are strong, there's still a sense that something is missing. Depth, not visual depth, but functional depth. You see the system, you see how it looks, you see how it operates on the surface. But the film doesn't always explore the logic behind it. The strategy, the evolution, the reasoning behind certain choices, it's hinted at, but rarely fully developed. Some elements feel more like visual ideas than fully realized systems, impressive to look at, memorable in motion, but not always grounded in deeper explanation, and that creates a subtle disconnect. Because the world feels real in its design, but not always in its logic. Still, it's hard to ignore how much of the film's identity comes from this aspect. The costumes alone leave an impression. The way they move, the way they contrast with the environment, the way they define each group, it all contributes to a sense of unity and purpose. Even individual characters are elevated by this design. A commander doesn't just lead through dialogue, they lead through presence, through armor, through silhouette, through the way they stand within the frame, and that's powerful, because in a film where character depth is limited, visual identity becomes a substitute. You may not know everything about these characters, but you recognize them. You remember how they look, how they move, where they belong, and in a film built around spectacle, that matters. So while The Great Wall may struggle in other areas, story, character, emotional weight, when it comes to costume design, set construction, and visual world building, it knows exactly what it's doing. It builds a world that feels organized, disciplined, prepared. Even if it doesn't always explain it, it makes you believe it exists, at least on the surface. When you talk about the Great Wall, one conversation keeps coming back again and again. Not the monsters, not the action, not even the visuals, the casting, because this isn't just about performances. It's about presence, about fit, about whether the people on screen actually belong in the world the film is trying to create. And right at the center of that discussion is the lead, Matt Damon. On paper, it makes sense. He's a recognizable star, proven, reliable, someone who can carry a large-scale production and bring global attention to it. In a film designed to bridge markets, that kind of casting feels strategic. But once the film begins, the question changes. Not can he lead this movie, but does he belong in this movie? And that's where the divide begins. Because for some viewers, Damon does exactly what's required. He's steady, competent. He delivers the action, the physicality, the presence expected from a character like this. He moves through the film with a kind of quiet control, never overplaying, never distracting. In a story that doesn't demand deep emotional range, that's enough. But for others, it's not about what he does. It's about what he doesn't bring. There's a sense, subtle but noticeable, that his performance doesn't fully connect with the world around him. The tone, the setting, the style of the film, it all exists at a certain level of intensity and visual identity, and he sometimes feels slightly out of sync with it. Not completely disconnected, but not fully integrated either, and that creates distance. Even small things like the way he speaks, the rhythm of his dialogue, the inconsistency in his accent start to stand out. Not enough to break the film, but enough to pull attention away from it. And when that happens, the performance stops being invisible. It becomes noticeable. And in a film like this, that matters, because the world is already stylized. The visuals are heightened. The tone is uneven. The last thing you need is a central performance that feels like it's operating on a different frequency. But Damon isn't the only part of this conversation. The supporting cast brings a different energy. There's a stronger sense of alignment, of belonging within the world. The performances feel more in tune with the film's visual style, its tone, its rhythm. They carry a kind of presence that fits naturally within the structure of the story. And that contrast makes the casting debate even more visible, because it's not just about whether the performances are good or bad. It's about whether they match the film. Some performances feel like they're part of the system, others feel like they're passing through it. That's where the idea of miscasting comes in. Not necessarily because someone lacks ability, but because they don't fully align with the role, the tone, or the world. And in this case, that conversation extends beyond performance. It touches on something bigger. The decision to center a Western actor in a story so deeply rooted in Chinese setting and mythology sparked a broader reaction. For some, it felt like a familiar pattern, one that shifts focus away from the culture the film is built around. For others, it was simply part of the film's structure, given that the story begins from an outsider's perspective, and the film itself sits somewhere in the middle. It doesn't completely revolve around its Western lead, but it also doesn't fully move away from him. The narrative still follows his arc, his transformation, his journey from self-interest to participation in a larger cause. So the question remains, is he the center of the story or just the entry point? And depending on how you see that, the casting either works or it doesn't. But here's the key point. The performances in The Great Wall aren't disastrous. They're not the reason the film fails or succeeds. They're functional. They serve the structure. They support the action. They move the story forward, but they rarely elevate it. There are moments where stronger emotional presence could have added weight, where deeper character work could have grounded the spectacle, but those moments pass without leaving a lasting impact. And that's what defines the performances overall. Not bad, not exceptional, just present, doing what's needed, in a film that's more focused on what you see than on who you're watching. For all its scale, for all its spectacle, for all its visual ambition, The Great Wall has a quiet problem at its core. It struggles to make you care, not about what's happening, not about the battles, but about the people inside them. And that's where the film starts to lose something important, because no matter how big the conflict is, no matter how many creatures are charging toward the wall, the real weight of any story comes from its human stakes. Who is at risk? What do they stand to lose? Why should we feel it? And here, those answers never fully land. The characters are there, clearly defined in function: leaders, warriors, strategists, outsiders. They have roles. They have purpose within the structure of the story, but beyond that, there's very little depth. You understand what they do. You don't always understand who they are. Backstories are hinted at, but rarely explored. Motivations are introduced, but not deeply examined. Relationships form, but they move too quickly to feel earned. Emotional beats appear, and then disappear just as fast. It's not that the film ignores character. It just doesn't give it enough time, and that's where pacing begins to work against it, because the story moves so quickly, so focused on action, on momentum, that it doesn't pause long enough for emotional investment to build. Moments that should feel significant, loss, sacrifice, transformation, arrive and pass before they have a chance to resonate. You see what happens, but you don't always feel it, and that creates distance. When someone is injured, when someone falls, when a decision is made that should carry weight, the impact is limited, not because the moment isn't important, but because the foundation hasn't been built. There's no emotional history behind it. No connection strong enough to make it land. Even the central transformation, the shift from self-interest to responsibility, follows a familiar path. It's clear, it's straightforward, it's easy to understand, but it doesn't dig deeper. It doesn't challenge the character in a way that feels complex or unexpected. It's a transition you recognize, not one you experience, and the same applies to the relationships. There's an attempt to create connection, to build trust, to hint at something more, but it remains surface level. The film gestures toward emotional depth without fully committing to it. It introduces the possibility, but doesn't explore the consequences. So what you're left with is a story where the events feel larger than the people. The battles matter more than the individuals fighting them. The spectacle carries more weight than the characters experiencing it. The world is detailed, structured, visually rich, but the human element inside that world feels underdeveloped, and that's the trade-off. Because when a film prioritizes scale and momentum, something has to give. Here, it's the emotional core, but that doesn't mean the film is empty. There are glimpses, moments where you can see what it could have been. A line of dialogue that hints at history, a look that suggests conflict, a decision that carries the outline of something deeper, but those moments are brief, they don't expand, they don't anchor the story. And without that anchor, the stakes remain external, the danger is real, the threat is clear, the conflict is constant, but the emotional connection, the reason to truly invest, never fully takes hold. So when the film reaches its biggest moments, its most dramatic confrontations, its final resolutions, you understand what's happening, but you don't always feel what's at stake, and that's what separates spectacle from impact. Because spectacle can impress you, but emotional depth is what stays with you. And in The Great Wall, that depth is always just out of reach. If visuals are what The Great Wall does best, then writing is where it begins to show its limits. Because underneath all the color, all the scale, all the movement, there's a script trying to hold everything together. And that script doesn't always rise to the level of what's on screen. The first thing you notice is how functional the dialogue feels. It does its job. It delivers information. It moves the story forward. It tells you what you need to know about the threat, about the plan, about what's coming next. But rarely does it do more than that. There's very little texture, very little nuance, very little personality that truly stands out. Conversations don't linger. They don't unfold naturally. They arrive, serve a purpose, and move on. And because of that, the dialogue often feels less like something characters would say, and more like something the script needs them to say. It's efficient, but it's also forgettable. Then there's the tone. At times, the film leans into a kind of classic action-adventure style, short exchanges, bits of banter, lines meant to feel sharp or memorable. Occasionally, that works. It adds energy. It gives certain moments a bit of personality. But just as often, it feels slightly out of place. The rhythm doesn't always match the world. The style of the dialogue doesn't always align with the tone the film is trying to maintain. And that creates a subtle disconnect between how the film looks and how it sounds. You can feel that especially in the English dialogue. There's a stiffness to it at times, a sense that the lines are being delivered rather than lived. Not because the actors can't perform, but because the writing doesn't always give them enough to work with. It's not organic, it's constructed, and that construction becomes more visible when the film tries to reach for something deeper. Because there are moments where the script hints at bigger ideas about trust, loyalty, sacrifice, purpose. The themes are there, the intention is there, but the dialogue rarely carries them far enough. Instead of expanding those ideas, it states them clearly, directly, quickly, and then moves on. There's very little room for subtext, very little space for interpretation. What the characters feel, what they believe, what they're struggling with, it's often presented on the surface, without the layers that make those moments resonate. And that affects the emotional weight of the story. Because when dialogue lacks depth, the characters struggle to feel real. And when the characters don't feel real, the stakes don't feel personal. There's also a sense, especially as the film progresses, that the script is built around necessity rather than discovery. Events happen because they need to happen. Information appears when it's required. Solutions arrive at the exact moment they're needed. The dialogue supports that structure, guiding the audience from one point to the next without much resistance. But in doing so, it removes tension, because nothing feels uncertain, nothing feels unpredictable, nothing feels like it's being uncovered, it feels like it's being delivered, and that's the core issue. The writing isn't terrible. It's not distracting enough to break the film. It doesn't collapse under its own weight. It holds everything together just enough to support the spectacle, but it never elevates it. It never gives the film a stronger voice. It never adds the layer of depth that could turn this from something entertaining into something memorable. Instead, it stays in the background, supporting, guiding, but never leading. And in a film where everything else is trying to be bold, the visuals, the scale, the action, that restraint becomes noticeable. Because when the writing plays it safe, the film does too. There's a feeling you get while watching The Great Wall, and it's hard to ignore once you notice it. The feeling that everything is happening, just a little too fast. Not in terms of pacing. We've already seen that the film moves quickly by design. But in terms of construction, how scenes connect, how moments build, how the story breathes, or more accurately, how it doesn't. Because this is a film that often feels compressed. Like entire sections of story, development, build-up, emotional progression have been shortened, tightened, or skipped altogether to keep things moving. And you can see it in the editing. Scenes begin late and end early. Conversations jump straight to their conclusion. Transitions move rapidly from one major event to the next, without always showing what happens in between. It's efficient, but it comes at a cost. Because storytelling isn't just about what happens, it's about how it unfolds. And here, that unfolding feels rushed. Take character moments, for example. Introductions are quick, relationships form quickly, trust is established quickly. Conflict appears and then resolves quickly. There's very little time for tension to develop, for uncertainty to linger, for the audience to sit with what's happening. Everything moves forward before it has a chance to settle. And that's where the editing starts to work against the film. Because instead of building momentum through progression, it builds momentum through compression. It cuts out the space where depth could exist, where emotion could grow, where stakes could become personal, where the audience could connect. And without that space, the story begins to feel like a sequence of events, rather than a continuous experience. One moment leads to the next, not because it naturally evolves, but because it's time to move on. You feel that especially in key transitions. Moments that should act as turning points, moments where the direction of the story shifts, arrive abruptly. They're introduced, resolved, and left behind before their impact fully registers. It's as if the film is constantly looking ahead, instead of allowing the present moment to matter, and that creates a sense of detachment. You understand what's happening, you follow the sequence, but you're not fully immersed in the journey, because the journey itself feels shortened. There's also a structural side to this. The film often feels like it's been built around its major set pieces. The battles, the large-scale moments, and everything else exists to connect them as quickly as possible. So instead of a story that grows organically, you get a story that moves between highlights, from one major event to the next, and while that keeps the film active, it also makes it feel fragmented. Not disconnected, but not fully cohesive either. You're watching the important moments, but you're missing the space between them. And that space is where stories usually come alive, where characters develop, where tension builds, where meaning takes shape. Without it, the film becomes more immediate but less impactful. Still, this approach isn't accidental. It aligns with the film's priorities. Keep it moving, keep it engaging, don't slow down. And for some viewers that works, because the film never drags, it never stalls, it never loses its forward motion. But for others, that same speed becomes the problem, because without time to breathe, the story never fully lands. It passes by instead, and that's what defines the editing of The Great Wall. Not sloppy, not confusing, but compressed, a film that moves quickly because it doesn't allow itself the time to be anything else. When you look at The Great Wall, one name carries a certain weight: Zhang Yimou, a director known for visual poetry, for precision, for turning movement, color, and space into something almost artistic. His earlier films weren't just stories, they were experiences, carefully composed, emotionally grounded, visually unforgettable. So when a filmmaker like that steps into a project of this scale, a global production, a crossover between industries, the expectation shifts. You don't just expect spectacle, you expect vision, and that's where things become complicated, because on the surface you can still see his fingerprints, the use of color, the emphasis on symmetry, the way large groups move in coordinated patterns, the framing of action as something almost choreographed rather than chaotic. There are moments, clear moments, where the film feels guided by a director who understands visual composition at a high level. Shots that feel intentional, sequences that feel designed, images that linger even after the scene has moved on. That part is still there, but at the same time, something feels different. Because while the visuals carry his style, the storytelling doesn't always carry his depth. There's a shift in approach. Instead of focusing on character, emotion, and layered narrative, the elements that gave his earlier work its impact, the film leans heavily into scale and accessibility. It prioritizes clarity over complexity, movement over stillness, spectacle over introspection, and that changes the experience, because it begins to feel less like a film driven by a singular creative voice and more like a film shaped by multiple demands. A film designed not just to tell a story, but to reach an audience, a global audience, and you can feel that in the way the film is structured. The pacing is tighter, the dialogue is more direct, the themes are simplified. The action is amplified. Everything is built to be understood quickly, to be experienced immediately, to be accessible across different viewing expectations. And while that makes the film easier to follow, it also limits how far it can go. Because the more a film tries to appeal to everyone, the harder it becomes to feel truly distinct. There's also a sense that the direction at times becomes restrained. Not visually, those elements are still bold, but narratively. The film doesn't take many risks. It doesn't push its ideas further. It doesn't explore its themes with the depth you might expect from a director known for more layered storytelling. Instead, it follows a clear path, a controlled path, one that delivers what it promises, but rarely goes beyond it. And that's where the contrast becomes most noticeable. Because when you think about what Zhang Yimou has done before, films that balanced beauty with emotion, spectacle with meaning, you start to see what's missing here. Not skill, not craftsmanship, but focus, a sense of artistic priority that goes beyond delivering a product. Because this film, more than anything, feels like a collaboration shaped by expectation, a meeting point between industries, between styles, between markets, and in that meeting something gets diluted, not entirely lost but softened. The edges are smoother, the risks are lower, the vision is broader but less personal. Still, it's important to recognize what the direction does achieve. It organizes chaos. It turns large-scale action into something visually coherent. It maintains clarity even when the screen is filled with movement. It ensures that the spectacle remains readable, structured, controlled. And that's not easy, because directing at this scale, balancing hundreds of elements within a single frame, requires precision, and that precision is there. But what's missing is the layer beneath it, the emotional resonance, the narrative depth, the sense that the film is driven by something more than its surface. So in the end, Zhang Yimou's approach in The Great Wall feels like a compromise between artistry and accessibility, between personal vision and global expectation, between what the film could have been and what it chose to become. And while the result is still visually striking, it never fully reaches the level of distinction his name suggests. When you watch The Great Wall, it's almost impossible not to think about what came before it, because this isn't just any director stepping into a large-scale production. This is Zhang Yimou, the filmmaker behind works that didn't just look beautiful, they felt meaningful. Films where action wasn't just movement but emotion, where color wasn't just design but storytelling, where every frame carried intention beyond spectacle. And that's what makes this comparison unavoidable, because in The Great Wall, you can still see glimpses of that filmmaker, in the way the armies move, in the symmetry of the compositions, in the bold use of color to define identity and structure. There are moments, brief but clear, where the film reminds you of that earlier style. Moments where the visuals feel carefully crafted, almost painterly, where the action feels choreographed with purpose rather than just intensity. But those moments don't define the film. They appear and then they pass, because unlike his earlier work, where visual beauty and emotional depth were inseparable, here the balance shifts. The visuals remain. The depth it doesn't always follow. That's where the difference becomes most noticeable. In those earlier films, the spectacle served the story. Here, the story often serves the spectacle, and that changes everything. Because instead of building toward emotional resonance, the film builds toward scale. Instead of allowing moments to linger, to unfold, to carry weight, it moves quickly, pushing forward, prioritizing momentum over reflection. The result is a film that looks impressive, but rarely feels as impactful. There's also a difference in focus. Before, characters carried the narrative. Their choices, their conflicts, their relationships, those were the driving forces. The action existed within that framework. Here, the characters often feel secondary. They exist within the spectacle, rather than shaping it, and that shift reduces the emotional core that once defined his work. Even the storytelling itself feels different, simpler, more direct, less layered, the kind of storytelling designed to be immediately understood rather than gradually revealed. And while that makes the film more accessible, it also makes it less distinctive, because what made Zhang Yimou's earlier films stand out wasn't just how they looked, it was how they felt. There was weight, there was meaning. There was a sense that every visual choice connected to something deeper. There's one element in The Great Wall that exists both inside the story and above it. Matt Damon, not just as a character, but as a presence. Because when a film brings in a star of that level, it changes the dynamic immediately. You're not just watching William Garin, you're watching Matt Damon playing William Garin, and that distinction matters. Because star power carries weight, it brings familiarity, it brings expectation. It brings a kind of built-in credibility that shapes how the audience engages with the film. From the moment he appears, you already understand something about the character. Before he says a word, you expect competence. You expect capability. You expect him to survive. That's the power of a recognizable lead. It anchors the film, especially in a world that's unfamiliar, stylized, and filled with elements that require a certain level of suspension of disbelief. He becomes the point of stability, the constant in a shifting environment. And for a film designed to reach a global audience, that role is crucial, because while the setting may be new to some viewers, the face is not. It gives the audience something to hold on to, a way in, but at the same time, that presence can create distance, because when a star is too recognizable, when their identity exists so strongly outside the film, it can become harder to fully see them as the character. You're aware of them, not just what they're doing, but who they are beyond the role, and that awareness never completely disappears. In some moments, Damon blends into the world. He moves through the action. He carries the physical demands of the role. He delivers the performance with control and consistency. He does what's required, but in other moments, he feels separate, like he's stepping into the world rather than fully belonging to it, and that's not necessarily about performance. It's about fit, the tone of the film, the style of the world, the rhythm of the storytelling. They don't always align perfectly with his presence, and when that alignment is off, even slightly, it becomes noticeable. There's also the question of expectation, because a star like Damon comes with a history, previous roles, previous performances, a certain type of character he's known for, and that history shapes how you see him here. You might compare. You might expect more. You might look for the same depth, the same intensity, the same emotional range. And when the film doesn't ask for that, or doesn't provide the space for it, it can feel like something is missing. Not because he's doing less, but because you're expecting more. Still, his presence serves a purpose. It connects the film to a wider audience. It reinforces the film's global ambition. It provides a familiar anchor within a stylized world. And in that sense, it works, but it also highlights something else, the balance between star power and immersion, because the stronger the star, the harder it can be for the character to stand on its own. And The Great Wall exists right in that space, where Matt Damon is both an asset and a reminder that this film isn't just telling a story, it's reaching for something larger, a broader audience, a wider appeal, a presence that extends beyond the screen, and in doing so, it brings the star with it, for better and for worse. At the end of the day, when everything settles, the battles, the spectacle, the noise, there's one question that quietly defines The Great Wall. Does it feel new or does it feel known? Because this film exists right on that line, a line between originality and familiarity, On one hand, there's something undeniably unique about the concept. A legendary structure, reimagined as a defense against mythical creatures, ancient warfare combined with fantasy elements, a cultural setting that isn't often explored at this scale in global blockbusters. On paper, that's fresh. That's different, that's something that should stand out. But then you start watching the film and something shifts, because while the idea feels new, the execution feels familiar. The structure follows patterns you've seen before. The character arcs move in expected directions. The progression of the story unfolds exactly as you anticipate, and that creates a contrast. You're looking at something that appears original, but experiencing something that feels recognizable. And that recognition isn't subtle. It's in the way the story builds, in the way conflicts are introduced and resolved, in the way the film moves from one major moment to the next. You can see where it's going long before it gets there. Now, that's not always a flaw. Familiarity can be comforting. It makes the film easy to follow. It makes the experience accessible. It allows the audience to engage without having to adjust to something completely unfamiliar. But it also limits impact, because originality isn't just about having a new idea. It's about how that idea is explored, how it's developed, how it's presented, how it challenges what we expect. And that's where the Great Wall holds back. It doesn't take risks with its concept. It doesn't push its ideas into unexpected territory. It stays within the boundaries of what works, what's proven, what's already been established. And in doing so, it trades potential for reliability. It chooses structure over surprise, clarity over complexity, familiar beats over bold decisions. And the result is a film that feels balanced, not groundbreaking, not completely derivative, but somewhere in between. A film that introduces something new, but tells it in a way you've already seen. And that's the paradox, because the ingredients are there for something distinctive, a unique setting, a different cultural lens, a concept that could have been expanded in new directions. But instead of fully embracing that originality, the film wraps it in a familiar framework, and that framework defines the experience. You enjoy it. You follow it, you understand it, but it rarely surprises you. It rarely challenges you. It rarely stays with you, because familiarity, while effective, doesn't always leave a lasting impression. And that's where The Great Wall ultimately lands. A film that looks like something new, but feels like something you've already experienced. And in that space between originality and familiarity is where it finds both its strength and its limitation. Some films are made to be watched. Others are made to be experienced. And The Great Wall clearly belongs to the second category, because from the way it's shot, to the way it moves, to the way it fills the frame, this is a film designed with the big screen in mind. Not your laptop, not your phone, but a space where the visuals can surround you, and you feel that immediately. The scale of the wall, the depth of the landscapes, the height, the distance, the movement, everything is built to stretch beyond the screen. And when you see it in formats like IMAX or 3D, that intention becomes even more obvious. The camera doesn't just show you the environment, it pulls you into it. You're not just watching soldiers on the wall, you're standing there with them, looking down, looking out, feeling the vertical drop, the open space, the distance between safety and danger. That sense of depth is where the film finds one of its strongest advantages, because in 3D, those layers become more than visual, they become physical. Creatures don't just approach, they advance. Projectiles don't just fly, they move through space. Action doesn't just happen, it extends toward you. And in those moments, the film works exactly as intended. It becomes immersive, but that immersion comes with a condition. Because the experience depends heavily on how you watch it. On a large screen with the right format, the film feels expansive. The visuals breathe. The scale becomes tangible. But on a smaller screen, that effect starts to fade. The depth flattens, the distance shrinks. The spectacle becomes contained. And when that happens, you begin to notice something else. Because without the support of that immersive presentation, the film has less to rely on. The story remains the same. The characters remain the same. The structure remains the same. But the impact changes, because so much of the film's strength is tied to how it looks, how it feels in motion, how it occupies space, how it fills your field of vision. Take that away and the experience becomes more ordinary, still engaging, still watchable, but not as powerful. And that's what defines The Great Wall as a viewing experience. It's not just about what the film shows you, it's about how you see it. In the right setting, it becomes something larger, more immersive, more visually compelling. In the wrong setting, it loses some of that presence. And that's the trade-off of building a film so heavily around spectacle. Because when spectacle is the foundation, the screen becomes part of the storytelling. And here, that screen matters more than usual. Because The Great Wall doesn't just want your attention, it wants your space, your field of view, your sense of scale, your physical reaction to what's unfolding. And when it gets that, that's when it works best. By the time you reach the end of the Great Wall, one thing becomes clear. This isn't a film trying to be everything for everyone, but it is a film trying to be something specific for a very particular kind of viewer. And whether it works for you depends entirely on what you're looking for, because this is a film built on experience over depth. It's designed for viewers who want movement, who want scale, who want to sit back and watch something unfold without needing to analyze every layer of it. If you're someone who enjoys pure spectacle, large battles, constant action, visual intensity, this film delivers. It doesn't hold back. It doesn't slow down, it gives you exactly what it promises, and in that space it works. The pacing keeps you engaged, the visuals keep your attention, the structure keeps things easy to follow. It's the kind of film you can watch without effort and still enjoy. But that same approach means it won't work for everyone, because if you're looking for something deeper, something driven by character, emotion, or layered storytelling, this film might feel limited. The characters don't evolve in complex ways. The story doesn't challenge expectations. The themes are present but not deeply explored, and for some viewers, that's where the disconnect begins. Because once the spectacle fades, there isn't much left to hold on to. So the audience for this film becomes very specific. It works best for those who are willing to accept it on its own terms. As a fantasy action experience, not a historical epic, not a character-driven drama, not a film aiming for emotional depth, but something lighter, something immediate, something closer to a popcorn blockbuster. The kind of film you watch in the moment, enjoy for what it is, and move on from without needing it to stay with you. And there's nothing wrong with that, because not every film needs to be profound. Not every story needs to leave a lasting emotional mark. Sometimes, the goal is simply to entertain, and The Great Wall understands that. It knows its lane, it stays within it, it delivers what it promises. But it also doesn't go much further. So in the end, the real question isn't whether the film is good or bad, it's whether it aligns with your expectations. If you come in looking for scale, action, and visual spectacle, you'll find it. If you come in looking for depth, originality, and emotional weight, you might not. And that's what defines its audience. Not a universal appeal, but a targeted one. A film that works as long as you meet it where it stands. For all the criticism surrounding The Great Wall, for all the debates, the flaws, the missed opportunities, there's something important to recognize. This film does work in very specific ways, and when it works, it's hard to ignore. Let's start with the most obvious strength, the visuals. From the very first frame, the film establishes a clear identity, bold colors, massive environments, carefully constructed compositions. The Great Wall itself, the surrounding landscapes, the formations of the army, everything is designed to be seen, not just viewed, but experienced. There's a level of visual control here that stands out. The use of color to define different units, the choreography of large-scale movement, the way action is framed to remain clear even in chaos. It's not random spectacle, it's organized spectacle, and that makes a difference. Because even when the screen is filled with motion, you can still follow what's happening. That clarity gives the film a strong foundation. Then there's the scale. This is a film that understands how to fill space, the size of the armies, the volume of the creatures, the sheer number of moving elements in each sequence. It creates a sense of magnitude that few films attempt at this level. You're not watching small, contained action. You're watching something designed to feel large. And tied into that is the action itself. Constant, relentless, always moving forward. The film doesn't waste time. It delivers battles early and keeps delivering them. And for viewers who came for that experience, for spectacle, for intensity, that consistency is a strength. There's very little downtime, very little hesitation. It knows what it is and it sticks to it. Another strength lies in the film's visual world building. The structure of the army, the design of the armor, the way different units operate, it all creates a sense of system. A world that functions even if it's not fully explained. You can see the discipline, the preparation, the purpose behind the design, and that gives the film a kind of internal logic, at least on a visual level. It feels like something that has been built, not just imagined. There's also something to be said about the film's energy. It moves quickly, it stays active, it doesn't drag. Even when the story is simple, even when the characters are limited, the film maintains a forward momentum that keeps it engaging. You're never stuck waiting for something to happen. It's always happening, and for many viewers, that's enough. Finally, there's the film's accessibility. You don't need deep knowledge, you don't need context. You don't need to decode complex ideas. You can step in and follow it instantly, and that's a strength in itself, because it allows the film to reach a wide audience, different backgrounds, different expectations, different viewing styles. It's easy to understand, easy to engage with, easy to watch, and while that simplicity limits depth, it enhances reach. So yes, The Great Wall has its flaws, but it also has clear strengths: visual impact, scale, consistent action, structured world building. Accessible storytelling. It knows how to create an experience, even if it doesn't always go beyond it. And sometimes, that's exactly what a film sets out to do. For everything the Great Wall gets right, there's an equally clear set of things it struggles with. Not in small ways, but in ways that shape the entire experience. Because beneath the spectacle, beneath the visuals, the action, the scale, there are cracks. And once you start to notice them, they're hard to ignore. Let's start with the most consistent issue, the story, or more specifically, the lack of depth within it. The premise is strong, the setup is clear, the conflict is easy to understand. But once the film begins to unfold, it doesn't go much further. There are no real surprises, no meaningful twists, no sense of discovery. Everything follows a familiar path, and that predictability removes tension. Because when you know where a story is going, it's harder to feel invested in how it gets there. Then there's the characters. They exist, they function, they serve their roles within the story, but they rarely go beyond that. There's very little development, very little backstory, very little emotional complexity. You don't spend enough time with them to understand who they are, only what they do, and that creates distance. Because without strong characters, the stakes remain external. You see the danger, you understand the conflict, but you don't feel it. That leads directly into another weakness, emotional impact. Moments that should carry weight, loss, sacrifice, transformation, don't land as strongly as they could, not because they're poorly presented, but because the foundation isn't there. The film moves too quickly to build emotional connection. Which brings us to pacing and editing. Yes, the film is fast, but it's not just fast, it's compressed. Scenes feel shortened, transitions feel rushed, important moments pass before they have time to resonate. It's efficient storytelling, but not immersive storytelling. And that difference matters, because when a film doesn't give itself time to breathe, it loses depth. Then there's the CGI and visual consistency. While the scale is impressive, the quality isn't always even. Some sequences look polished and detailed. Others feel artificial, too smooth, too clean, too obviously digital. And when that inconsistency appears, it breaks immersion. You stop seeing the world and start seeing the construction. Another issue lies in the film's lack of originality, not in concept, but in execution. The structure feels familiar. The action feels inspired by other films. The progression follows known patterns. There's very little that feels truly distinct. And in a genre built on spectacle, that lack of uniqueness becomes noticeable. There's also the matter of tone. The film takes itself seriously, consistently, completely, but the concept itself is exaggerated, and without a layer of self-awareness to balance that, certain moments feel unintentionally awkward. The seriousness and the absurdity don't always align. And finally, there's the sense of missed potential, because the film has all the elements needed for something greater, a unique setting, a strong visual identity, a large-scale concept. But it doesn't fully explore them. It stays within safe boundaries. It avoids risk. It delivers what's expected without pushing beyond it. And that's what defines its weaknesses, not failure, but limitation. A film that could have been deeper, more distinctive, more impactful, but chooses to remain within a controlled, familiar space. And in doing so, it never quite reaches the level it feels capable of. So when everything is over, when the battles fade, when the spectacle settles, when the screen goes dark, what does the Great Wall actually leave behind? That's where the film reveals its final truth, because impact isn't measured in scale. It's not measured in budget. It's not even measured in how impressive something looks in the moment. It's measured in what stays with you. And this is where the experience becomes complicated. While you're watching the film, it works. The action keeps you engaged. The visuals keep your attention. The pace keeps things moving. It's easy to follow, easy to watch, easy to stay with. But once it ends, something starts to fade. Not immediately, but quickly. The details blur. The moments blend together. The specific scenes become harder to recall. You remember the idea. You remember the scale. You remember the general experience. But the film itself doesn't always leave a strong imprint. And that's the difference between something that entertains you and something that stays with you. Because memorability comes from distinction, from moments that stand out, from characters that feel real, from ideas that linger after the story is over. And while the Great Wall delivers spectacle, it doesn't always deliver that kind of impact. There are images you might remember, formations, colors, movement, scale, but not necessarily moments that carry emotional weight. Not necessarily scenes that define the experience in a lasting way. And that affects rewatch value, because rewatchability isn't just about whether a film is enjoyable. It's about whether there's something more to discover, something deeper to revisit, something that feels different the second time. Here, the experience is largely the same. You know the structure, you know the progression, you know where it's going. And without layers beneath the surface, there's less reason to return. That doesn't mean it isn't rewatchable. For the right audience, for those who enjoy the action, the visuals, the simplicity, it can absolutely be revisited as a spectacle, as a background experience, as something to watch without needing full attention, but as something that demands a second viewing, something that reveals more over time. That's where it falls short, and that brings us to its overall impact. The Great Wall is not a film that leaves a deep mark. It doesn't redefine its genre. It doesn't challenge expectations. It doesn't stay with you long after it ends, but it does something else. It delivers a momentary experience. A film that works while you're inside it and fades once you step out. And there's a place for that, because not every film needs to be unforgettable. Some are designed to be immediate, to be consumed in the moment, to provide a certain kind of experience and then let go. And that's exactly what this film does. It arrives, it entertains, it moves on, leaving behind just enough to remember what it was, but not enough to hold on to it for long.